Hello, Buzzkillers. It's the professor here, busting myths, taking names. You know, we don't talk enough about contemporary history or recent history on the show, but we are going to do that today, and I'm delighted that we have Dr. Tim Newburn with us all the way from London, who is the professor of criminology and social policy at the London School of Economics in the University of London, and also the official historian of criminal justice. And he's written this great new book. He's co-written this great new book called Orderly Britain with Andy Ward. And it's about how Britain has resolved everyday problems from dog fouling to double parking. Professor, thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, this book is just out, or it's coming out. I was sent a PDF copy by the publisher, as you know, and it's an eye-opening book for someone like me who first went to Britain in the very early 80s, then went to live there in the 1990s and saw a lot of social changes, but also, being an American, of course, was constantly making comparisons between the British way of doing things and the American way of doing things. And obviously British politeness, English politeness especially, came up a lot. So I'm grateful that you wrote the book. And I'm also grateful that you wrote it at the time you wrote it, because things have changed, as you quite rightly said. So let me ask you first, what was the impetus behind starting the book? I know you're an urban historian, you're a social scientist, you study these things, but it is a particularly eye-catching book. And I think that it's going to reach a lot more people than than the other history books we talk about on the show. So I'm curious how the inspiration hit you.
There's really, I think there are kind of two prompts for the book. One a big one and one a more particular one. The kind of, as you've sort of alluded to, in the day job, I'm a sociologist by training,
yes.
and a sort of a criminologist by practice, I suppose.
Right, okay.
That's how people would think of me as a criminologist. That'd be my kind of master identity as an academic.
Okay.
So my daily life, well, my entire life really, has been taken up with studies of crime and deviance, policing, drugs, social disorder, and so on. And at various stages, both at the outset of my career and more latterly, I've written quite a lot about riots and rioting. I have a very particular interest in, as it were, the breakdown of social order.
Yeah.
There's always felt to me something of an irony in writing about riots, because riots are unusual. They thankfully relatively rarely happen.
Right. Yeah. Genuine
and
riots.
The reason that we're interested in them is because they happen so rarely and because they're so significant when they do happen. But what it really should make us ask is, why don't they happen, rather than why do they happen, which is what our normal kind of focus is. So I've long harbored a desire to write something about the reverse of the day job, actually to write about a classic social scientific question, which is kind of what glues us together. What's the nature of our social order, and how should we understand it? But with that, I've also kind of wanted to try to write something which has a kind of academic intent, but isn't straightforwardly an academic book.
Right.
It's meant for a more general audience, which brings me to the more particular thing, which was I can't remember how many years ago now, but let's call it a decade. I was out walking with my, even then, she's still with us, I'm pleased to say, elderly aunt, even more elderly now, walking down a very rural lane in Oxfordshire in England. So a very rural place, rather kind of desolate. And the two of us were walking, and she had on a lead her little dog, a little terrier. We were walking down this lane, and at a certain stage, the dog stopped, as dogs do, to as it were, do its business.
Yeah.
Which it did at the side of the road, in the kind of hedgerow or by the hedgerow. So this was on a lane which almost no one, bar my elderly aunt, ever walks up and down. Where you only ever see cars, and her dog laid its deposit way away from even assuming there were walkers, anyone might walk. So it was of no impediment in any kind of way to anyone. But sure enough, as soon as the dog had stopped, she got a bag out of her pocket. She turned it inside out. She picked up this inglorious mess, tied up the bag, and then we walked the next 3/4 of an hour with her holding this really unpleasant goodie bag.
Yeah.
And I was just really struck that she'd done this.
Yeah.
And it was a kind of automatic thing, it seemed. And it was very much in contrast with my childhood or my adolescence. I grew up in urban England, in the Northwest, in the 1960s and 1970s. And the streets then were absolutely littered with dog mess. Any poor mother pushing a pram or a pushchair or whatever, it was just a minefield, a terrible thing. And I was just struck that this very mundane quotidian thing, just how much we'd changed in a period of 20 or 30 years. And so I kind of set about both looking at that, but also wanting to find half a dozen or more other very mundane things with which just to ask this question about, on the one hand, how have we changed? But on the other, or related to, what might any of this tell us about the nature of our community and our social order, our social glue?
Well, we like to highlight one or two chapters in our show. We don't want to give the whole book away because, of course, we want people to get it. And the book talks a lot more about a lot more things than just dog mess. But that's what I'd like to focus on because I think it's the transition is very, very interesting. First of all, I didn't know that in urban Britain in the 60s and 70s that there would be dog droppings on the sidewalk or there was pavement, as you say. I remember this from part of my growing up. We Americans tend to assume that the British have always been very orderly and very deferential and taking care of things, and the place seems very calm in all sorts of ways. Was there any talk in those olden times, so to speak, about dog mess as a problem? Of course, as you say now,
almost none.
It'd be unthinkable to walk away from it.
If you scour news, if you scour the newspapers, if you go through the Times or various, for the whole of the post-war period, you'll hardly find any reference to any of these things. Occasionally in people's memoirs and things, there'll be a reference to it, but usually the reference is the kind of comparison I'm making, people looking back and saying, I can't believe how bad it used to be given what we do now. And my memory of those times is that what was pretty typical would have been my experience, which was as a youngster, walking out down the streets with my mother, who was very proper and would have used a whole variety of euphemisms, as I've done already on the show for these things. She would have used
right. We are a PG show, so I can't give the.
And she would have said, "Look, mind the dog poo," and she would have, if she'd said this 3 times every time we went out walking, she did it a dozen times. It would have been it was, as I've used the phrase before, a minefield. And yet it didn't seem strange. I suspect there was a degree to which there was a kind of, it was a reluctant public acceptance. No one liked this. Everyone would have preferred to avoid it. But there was no suggestion, the best that anyone would have done, the most civil anyone would have been to take the dog to the curb and, and do this in the side of the road in the hope that it would get washed away.
Right. It's remarkable because I don't mean to skip too far ahead here, but the 2 lengthy periods I spent in Britain were very punctuated by smoking, first of all, being completely ubiquitous and then being gone within a matter of almost 2 years, it seemed to me. And so the fact that that sort of change happens so quickly, and these other changes happen in what we think of as a placid, very traditional society, fascinated me. But what our listeners and readers will love is your wonderful analysis and comparison of Burnley in the UK with New York City in the United States and their efforts in the 70s of cleaning up the dog mess problem. And the 70s was 50 years ago, so that counts as history even before contemporary history. So can you tell us a little bit about that? You compare them so well and so extensively in that chapter. Can you take the buzzkillers through a sort of chronology of what happened?
Where England is concerned, this all starts as a kind of emergent story about public health. That was the belief.
Yeah.
There were a few television programs which focused on what seemed to be new research, which suggested that Toxocara canis, roundworms in dog fouling, contained it was a potential risk to health, and particularly children's health. And there were a couple of television programs that gave this a bit of newsworthiness. But I think at that stage, there was no real sense that this was going to become, as it were, a public problem, a public issue, until, as you say, the otherwise, I mean, lovely place, but otherwise rather unremarkable Lancashire town of Burnley, a small industrial northwest town.
Mentioned in the Beatles song, I think, at one stage.
Mentioned in the Beatles song and various other places, but
most people wouldn't know it. Yeah.
Not terribly well known to most English people, let alone people internationally, sort of thing. Local councillors, local politicians there kind of, obviously some of them watched this program, read some of the official reports that are around, and frankly kind of freaked out, really.
Yeah.
Took it upon themselves when no one else was doing anything about this to react. And they decided that the best thing that they could do was actually take very extreme action. And they essentially, almost overnight in the late 1970s, they issued a bylaw and a public proclamation, effectively, banning all dogs from 3 of the main parks in the town.
Right.
So, not the sort of thing that we're used to today of, well, if your dog does something, then please pick up after it. This was, if you have a dog, you're not welcome in our main public parks. And not surprisingly, I think it caused an outcry among the good dog owners of Burnley, who decided, this is obviously, these are an incredibly respectable group of people in a variety of ways, middle-aged, middle class, who embarked on some initially kind of low-level protests, but what eventually became the most extraordinary campaign of civil disobedience. So sit-ins, or what they call dog-ins, the mass trespass, so mass trespass with dogs in order to, as it were, break the local bylaw, marches on Parliament, on Downing Street, so the Prime Minister's residence in London, with campaign literature and dogs. And to the point at which several of the most high profile of the local dog owners refused all efforts to get them to abide by these new bylaws, to the point at which one of them was jailed for 3 weeks for refusing to stop walking her dog. Now, at the end of that kind of 12 months of conflict, prison sentences and all sorts of things, the whole thing in Burnley kind of rather petered out. But what it had done in England was it had kind of put the problem on the map. People started talking about this and thinking about this a little more. There was no appetite in government, or indeed other local councils, local towns, to ban dogs. But there began to become more interest in this as a problem. What do we do about these deposits in our parks and playgrounds and public areas? That gave rise then to what was then a kind of decade and a half of change. But what fascinated me, I mean, in another area of my professional life, focusing on policing, I spent a lot of time studying parallels between New York policing and policing in London, and the influence of New York on policing in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
But what seemed staggering to me in this particular case was, of all the places that Burnley turned out to be twinned with at the time, it was New York City. 2 less likely places you'd be hard to find.
Just in terms of size, the difference is unbelievable.
In terms of size, concentrations of population, kind of culture and sensibilities, all sorts of things. Manhattan's about as far from, and it's Manhattan essentially we're talking about, is about as far from sort of dusty industrial Lancashire as you can imagine. But the problem was arising at roughly the same time. Manhattanites, New York folk, were increasingly perturbed by their inability to navigate sidewalks without stepping in something deeply unpleasant. And for a while, various people had attempted to introduce amendments to kind of state public health law. But by 1977, almost the same year that Burnley was doing its stuff, they finally introduced the first, as far as I'm aware, the first US requirement to pick up after dogs.
Right.
But they went for, what we subsequently, 20 years later, became kind of ubiquitous in the UK, which was dogs are fine. It's actually the owners that are the problem.
Yeah.
Burnley was treating the dogs as the problem. Subsequently, everywhere has treated the owner as the focus of control. It's, if we have pets, we're the ones who have to regulate our sense. We're the ones who have to pick up.
Right. You can't fine the dog for fouling the
You can't fine the dog.
Yeah.
And banning it is just going too far.
But also there were all these other things that were tried. For instance, you talk about in 1958, the building of a concrete-based prototype toilet for dogs.
Yeah.
On 92nd and York Avenue in Manhattan. And of course, the dogs refused to use it. But it is astounding to me how many things were tried before, in general, both in Burnley and in New York, were tried before getting to we need to make the owners responsible.
That's right. I mean, I think when first grappling with this as an issue, people are focused on dogs and their detritus, and therefore all those questions of, can you train a dog to do all this stuff at home?
Yeah,
which was a kind of live issue in England. It's completely useless as a solution to the problem in Manhattan, where everyone effectively, the vast majority of people live in apartments. So, the backyard doesn't exist, sort of thing. But yeah, dog toilets, Paris. I mean, one of my favorite examples is Paris. Paris for many years, in the 70s, at the same time as this was happening in New York and in Burnley, Paris had a massive problem of dirty streets. But for at least a couple of decades ago, then their response was, as it were, to focus on the detritus or the dog rather than the owner. And my favorite's the motocrotte, which was a scooter. So the Parisian authorities had people riding around on scooters with, on the back of them, anyone who wants to look these up can find them on the pictures on the internet. On the back, they've got kind of big baskets, big boxes on the back, and the rider of the scooter has essentially in one of their hands a vacuum, in which they go around vacuuming up all this stuff. Now, I mean, again, they too experimented with Canisienne, with dog toilets and all the rest, but with the same problem that, of course, you can build those things, but they're never in the place where the problem, or at the time the problem occurs. So, eventually it seems the only practical solution is to focus on us, the human owner.
Right, and you mentioned, and by the way, I can't resist this, but the whole acronym thing, especially in this chapter, is hilarious.
It's wonderful.
Not with the first in 72, there are these attempts to have a dog pooper scooper award law, and all kinds of groups. Pets Are Worth Safeguarding, Dog Owners Guild, the Pet Owners Protective Association, all rise up against this. And the other side organizes a group called Scoop, Stop Crapping on Our Premises.
Yep.
I mean, it's almost as if they're purposely turning it into a Mel Brooks movie.
It's wonderful. It's one of the to jump into another chapter, and I'll come back to this. There's a chapter on toilets, and particularly there's a focus on public lavatories. As I remember, I haven't got it in front of me, but there's a quote from someone from an official report, British parliamentary report in the late 20th century, who said, British culture lavatory humour is rife in British culture, but the problem of local toilets is no laughing matter, which I thought was rather wonderful. But of all these subjects, I mean, dog poop, or whatever we're going to call it, seems to just invite hilarity, I think. There are just a legion of stories which, in the midst of everyone taking this desperately seriously, are, as you say, just fundamentally comic.
Yeah, and it is amazing how many people, in both cases, in both Burnley and in New York and obviously in Paris, took these things personally as a great affront to their individual liberty, not necessarily to their dog's liberty, but to their individual freedom. How difficult was it to actually put these things into practice? I know from reading the book now that in 77, New York passes the first effectively pooper scooper law. I don't know how quickly that became highly followed properly, but is it something that more or less everybody joins in on? Like frankly, I was shocked that when the smoking ban started to come into Britain, I was shocked at how quickly it took over.
Yeah.
What happened with dog poop in the 70s?
And with one exception in the book, which we might come to, that is the story in almost all of these cases, which is change which sometimes takes a while to happen. So the smoking ban, the smoking ban in England occurred more than half a century after solid scientific evidence of the link between smoking and lung cancer was known about. So it was a long time coming. But once it was introduced, as you say, actually compliance levels were extraordinarily high, and all the scare stories about people's unwillingness to comply, their reluctance, and so forth came to naught. And essentially,
it also helped. It also helped that people, non-smokers, particularly militant non-smokers, went to pubs more often and restaurants more often. So that trade grew. So the publicans and the restaurant owners were happy.
Yeah, I mean, so the really interesting thing there, I think, is the big defense that the tobacco industry had in that half century of resisting massive change was essentially utilitarianism. It was essentially, the state should really only intervene in the lives of citizens when there's a risk to the citizenry generally.
Yeah.
And so the argument with smoking was, well, smokers are only harming themselves.
Yeah. But once the secondhand smoke thing came out, then
once secondhand or passive smoking came in, where the research evidence wasn't nearly as strong as it was in relation to lung cancer, that essentially put paid to the utilitarian defense. And so, as you say, everyone, there was then a kind of a solid pressure for change. With dogs, I think the story is, with dog poop, I think the story is essentially the same. The process was slow. Burnley started all this in the 70s. I think Manhattan changed pretty quickly. The state public health law was amended in 77. It became operational in 78. All the evidence that I can see suggests that Manhattanites changed their behavior pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
In the UK, Burnley was doing this in the late 70s. Government got involved in the 90s. Over that period of 20 years, I think kind of attitudes and sensibilities changed. And all the evidence says, compliance with this set of strictures, thou shalt pick up after one's dog, is very high indeed. Sort of two things emerge from that which are quite interesting, I think. One of which is a lot of people might think that the law is important, and it is in one sense, which is to say it symbolizes or signals sort of what we as respectable citizens are supposed or required to do. But it's almost never used. It's almost never enforced. So, the numbers of fines imposed and all the rest of it, both in New York and in Burnley and elsewhere, we've always been very, very low.
Yeah, that's true.
It's not really, but beyond the symbolic level, it's not really been required. I think it's not really been central to the kind of behavioural change that we've seen. One little caveat, though, we're beginning. I don't know whether any of this is true of the US, but in the UK, we're beginning to see the emergence of a new issue, which is the dumping of the bags in which the dog mess is contained. So now, my sense is you're more likely to see dog bag litter than you are dog feces on the streets. Sometimes people will just hang it on trees or fences, or assuming that they've done their job.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and
I don't think we see that as much. It seems to go right into the trash cans that are in theory should be around all our parks.
Well, I've just found the limits of British civility for you then.
There you go. But you also mentioned that during this time, there were the 70s, 80s, let's say, there was a lot of discussion about the place of dogs in British society. And I remember the Thatcherite dangerous dogs, or when the pit bull thing, the Dangerous Dogs Act came out, and there was a big pushback on that. The Countryside Alliance and all sorts of other people were very unhappy with that. So with the poop, was there any sort of sense that this was, the old, probably not Oscar Wilde, but some Irish saying was that I'd like to come back as an Englishman's dog? Was there a sense that it's very un-English to regulate dogs at all, including leash laws, what we call it?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are interesting cultural variations in relation to what one can kind of do in relation to dogs in terms of constraint or restraint. So leash laws, my experience of the US and Australia, for example, is that the freedom to allow a dog just to roam off the leash is much more restricted in many parts of those countries than it is in the UK, where the freedom to allow your dog to wander still seems to be part of our sort of unwritten constitution. And so the old kind of political saying of, sensible politicians throw rocks at dogs sort of thing is imbued, I think, in the kind of British understanding of things. By and large, I think that there wasn't a great deal of pushback on this. I think most of this change was managed. It took some time, which is probably a kind of indication of a degree of kind of concern about how far one should go. But in the main, I think local councils, government, etc., even though the kind of public health thing ceased after a while to be the major issue, was still able to use it as a basis for protecting children. Protecting children is always a good way. If anything trumps a dog, it's a child, sort of thing. So you can use children, I think, to do this. But I think the other kind of clever way in which the issue, in some ways, was utilized and manipulated was to present it as being part of the welfare of the dog. That it was all wrapped up in responsible dog ownership. That what the responsible dog owner washes the dog, walks the dog, feeds the dog properly, picks up after the dog, keeps the dog safe from other dogs, ensures that the dog doesn't attack humans, doesn't run into the road. I think it all became bound up in responsible citizenship, or more specifically, the responsible dog owner. So the whole thing was represented and shifted.
Well, what can we say then about, by the way, Buzzkillers, the book goes on to talk about smoking, drinking, queuing, that most British of all things, toilets, parking, and then ends up with a fantastic chapter on the pandemic and how that has, the orderliness of Britain has changed because of that. But after doing all this research, what can you say about orderliness now in Britain, and how has it changed? I mean, you say in the introduction that people like Lynn Truss and Bill Bryson, who wrote books in the 80s/90s about the orderliness and calmness of British people, now talk about how that has almost completely gone away. What has your research shown?
My shtick is the kind of reverse from so much of what's kind of written about modern society and modern Britain, more particularly. As I kind of admit in the book, sort of miserablism and declinism. So that sense of, on the one hand,
right,
we're all going to hell in a handcart, or things ain't as good as they used to be, is absolutely the way to sell books. That's what people lap it up.
Yeah, that's true.
There is no limit to the appetite for being told that things are just going awfully wrong. Wouldn't it be better if we got back to the good old ways of doing things? It's quite clearly taking a big risk in terms of publishing a book and trying to sell it, of taking the complete reverse position, which is, or not the complete reverse position, which is to say, actually, this is a kind of anti-miserabilist book. It's saying we've always been pretty fundamentally orderly. Frankly, that's the nature of society anyway. That's how we organize ourselves and we get along. And actually, we still are. And there are all sorts of ways in which you can see it, whether it's the in relation to our pets or our drinking and smoking habits, or the way in which we stand in line or queue. These things have all changed, but they're all still orderly in particular ways. But fundamentally, at the end, as you say, I think one of the big questions when I was thinking about all this would have been, well, okay, but what if something really dramatic happens? What happens, obviously, what happens if there's a war? What happens if there's something really, really dramatic? Of course, and very sadly, we had it. We had the pandemic. Our lives were upturned in ways which were extraordinarily shocking and life-changing, socially altering in a variety of ways. We were required to change the ways we organized ourselves, staying at home, not going to work, keeping a social distance, wearing masks, not attending births and deaths and all sorts of other things. And although in the UK, there were massive legal changes and huge regulatory changes, a little bit like, the dog thing or various other things, most of the time, most of that wasn't enforced. I mean, it would have been impossible for the cops to do it anyway. They did some stuff. They had bigger fish to fry. Got some stuff wrong, but they realized quite quickly that actually most of the time all they were doing was alienating people. So over time they learned to stand back from all of that. What we found was, we obeyed the rules. Most people did most of the time, and they did so because of a sense of collective responsibility. And in a sense, that's the tale of the whole book, I think, which is we are held together by the social glue that sociologists and criminologists would call informal social control, informal civic oversight, the general kind of community-based forms of social solidarity that keep everything, all the wheels turning and everything going. And it is therefore consequently not necessarily a book-selling tale because it's too positive, but I think it's an optimistic story about the kind of fortitude, solidarity, and predictability under immense social challenge.
Yes, and all of this happening in the 20th century, which a lot of people argue has been the most challenging and perhaps the most, in the long term, pessimistic because of the wars and because of climate change. Well, this has been a wonderful discussion, Professor, and I thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I've been delighted to talk about it, and much appreciated.
And we're going to promote the book here. We have a lot of listeners in Britain. Britain is our second largest market in terms of, well, I guess Canada's our second largest, Britain's our third, because we do an awful lot of Churchill debunking. And we're obviously going to promote the book there, but we're going to promote it here too, because almost all these things have parallels in the United States. So again, thanks a million for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And Buzzkillers out there, we will talk to all of you next week.